This is JS Party, your weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. New year, same web dev podcasting goodness. Share the show with a friend if you dig it, and hook us up with a 5-star review to let random internet strangers know what's up. That'd be pretty cool. Thank you to our partners at Fly.io, the home of Changelog.com. Fly transforms containers into micro VMs that run on their hardware in 30 plus regions on 6 continents, so you can launch your app near your users. Learn more at Fly.io. Okay, hey, it's party time, y'all.
Hello, everybody. Another week. This is my first recording of 2024, and I could not think of a better first interview for me of this year than the topic we're going to do today and with the guest that we're going to do it with. So we're here today to talk about htmx. You may have heard about this thing a lot lately. It's having its moment. It's having its 15 minutes. And we're here to talk about htmx with none other than the creator of htmx, Carson Gross. Hello, Carson. Welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk about htmx and then just the web more generally.
Absolutely. Because we're going to not just talk about htmx, we're here to talk about rendering patterns. And we're going to talk about the history of all the different ways we've been doing this dance since the beginning of JavaScript and HTML. And here to join us for that discussion of the web dance is a person who I'm calling WP3000. Can you take a guess for okay, it's Alex Russell, okay? It's Alex Russell. Welcome, Alex. But Alex, can you guess what WP stands for in this WP3000?
I hope it's web platform, not WordPress, but no shade to WordPress. Love me some WordPress, but yeah.
It's definitely web platform, because I feel like you are Mr. Web Platform 3000. That is who you are. And
I thought I was just here to represent the sedimentary history of web development, from the ancient person's perspective. I'm here with your dad jokes and your,
yelling at the cloud.
Yeah. Yes.
Let's not forget the yelling.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so welcome, Alex. We're so excited to have you back on the show. So Carson, and just kind of doing a little bit of prep for this show, I noticed that not only have you been on JS Party before, which by the way, I completely slept on that episode, I guess. This was a few years ago. So you've been on JS Party talking about this topic, but you also were on Go Time about a year ago talking about HTMX with those folks. And that was a brilliant discussion. I highly recommend folks to check it out. We'll link it in the notes. But we're excited to have you back again today and, kind of fast forward a year. I would say maybe not the average developer, but I would say the average tech Twitter developer, has heard of HTMX, and so I think some of the things that you were mentioning in that interview with the Go folks was that React is king, and for better or worse, and no one knows about HTMX, and that's the unfortunate part. Even though this is a good idea, it hasn't really gained popularity or wide-scale adoption and yada, 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 right? And so I'm excited to see that we've moved the needle on that a little bit. However, just because developers are talking about it doesn't mean it's actually being used at companies at scale as well, right? So hopefully we'll dig into all of that. So before we get into kind of the crux of what is HTMX, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, Carson? You've got a really interesting background. You've been working on the web a long time. So very eager to hear a bit about your backstory.
Sure. I've been developing for the web for a very long time now. Started working with the web back in 98, 99. Was doing Java applets. It's kind of ironic that I'm now sort of an ambassador for hypermedia, because early on I didn't like HTML. I preferred the more thick client style applications that Java applets, and there was this thing called Java Web Start that was around for a long time, and I tried to use that rather than embrace the web, but eventually the web kind of got me. And it just became compelling enough. And so I started doing, and I was, my primary web development, when I did structured web development beyond just sort of CGI scripts, which was the very early way you would do dynamic web pages, it was mainly in the Rails environment. So did a couple of startups, did some early work in Java, kind of worked for a company that built its own web platform that I worked on a little bit. And then after that, it kind of went over to Rails mid to late 2000s. From there, I worked at a startup, or me and a couple other guys did a startup based on Rails, developed sort of a lot of more traditional Web 1.0 style application functionality. And one of the things that came up when I was doing that was this idea. I was actually working on a problem where I was trying to sort a table. And I was trying to do this in probably around 2007. And I was trying to do it in JavaScript on the client side because that was faster, I had been told. And it was like way slower. I mean, maybe it was a skill issue, whatever, but I just couldn't make it work. And I just almost out of desperation tried this trick of like sorting it on the server side and then slamming it into the DOM using the inner HTML of a table. And it was really, really fast. And so I was kind of shocked, but I took that approach and I started using it. And first I had like a little custom jQuery based function. I was using that, but then it eventually grew into something called Intercooler JS. I released that as an open source tool back in the in like 2013, I think.
And like, where does one release open source in 2013? I can't remember when GitHub became a thing. Probably around that time. Was this like, did you put this up on GitHub?
Yeah, it was up on GitHub. It was GitHub, I think, was 2010-ish.
Okay.
It all blurs at this point, but
right.
But yeah, so I open source. It was my first real foray into open source software, and it went okay. It didn't take over the world, obviously, because at the same time, sort of Angular was the thing right when I was releasing Intercooler JS, and then React came in and kind of shoved everything else out of the way at that point. And so I feel like Intercooler JS was just sort of this interesting thing, but it was based on jQuery, which is sort of old and weird. And it just wasn't right for the zeitgeist at the time. And then I ended up moving. I was in California for a long time. I'm a California native, and I ended up moving to Montana after the last startup I worked at kind of blew up, and just wanted to change the scenery. And so I moved out to Montana, and I started teaching at Montana State. But during COVID, I took a look at Intercooler, which wasn't really going anywhere, and was like, man, it's probably time to. JavaScript has come a long way, and so maybe we should try and rewrite this in vanilla JavaScript. Let's take Intercooler JS and see if we can rewrite it in vanilla JavaScript. And so I did that, and I ended up releasing it as htmx. And that's kind of been the history of how I got here anyways. So it's sort of a clean room implementation of Intercooler JS. Although I don't know how clean room I'd call it, because when I wrote it, I was like, I'm going to be Internet Explorer compatible. And so I sort of cut myself off from a lot of modern JavaScript when I did that. And so it's, I think you could do an even cleaner room implementation of HTMX if you came at it from like a pure JavaScript perspective.
That's such a great background. Thank you so much for that summary. And I'm curious, at one point you said Web 1.0. And so can you kind of maybe just break down for folks like what you would put that, like what's the delimiter between 1.0 and 2.0? Sure.
Yeah. Web 1.0 would be like forms and links, and that's it. Not using forms with inputs and sort of the old ugly ka-chunk, like you click. Although I have to say these days browsers are much better at what would be called Web 1.0 applications, but where you're interacting using full web pages, like you click and go to a full new page, or you submit a form and then it does the I guess some of your listeners might not be familiar with this pattern, but there used to be this thing where you would submit a form, and if the form succeeded, you would redirect to another page in order to avoid like resubmitting the form. There were a lot of these sort of tricks around the early web and Web 1.0 applications. But it's the older, gronkier, like, I don't know, if you ever used MapQuest, I don't know if MapQuest is still a thing, but sort of like where you had to click on something and wait for a whole new page to refresh. That was sort of the Web 1.0 style of application.
Yeah.
And that's in contrast with the single page application.
Right. And we're like sending up like full HTML pages,
Yep.
And like using the web felt more taxing, right? And so that's why, from a user experience perspective, this like single page app, it just felt like, such a delight for users, right? Because like here we're just using like Ajax to like send bits of pieces back and forth, and you're not having to do a full page reload.
Yeah.
And yeah, with the 2.0 came like that rich interactivity, because we could now all of a sudden, we weren't doing these full round trips, right? But there's like a lot to kind of unpack there, which we'll get into in just a second. So let me toss the ball over to Alex. So Alex, I feel like Mr. WP3 3000 needs no introduction, but please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as well, Alex?
I'm apparently a product manager on the Edge team at Microsoft, but I still work on making web pages faster. And that work started when I was on the Chrome team at Google for a long time, because we started to see that folks who were trying to build these kinds of richer experiences that we were just talking about were getting beached pretty frequently. Folks would start with high ambitions for the end user, and then because of the tools and techniques and cultural assumptions that they had brought with them from what was in circa 2015, 2016, the dominant ideology about how you built nice things on the web, we ended up with teams who had built themselves into a corner with extremely tall piles of JavaScript in a moment when the market was changing dramatically. So since 2015 or 16, we've seen, just the continued explosion of what happened in 2007 with the iPhone moment. But, from 13, 14, it was pretty clear that diffusion was going to take hold worldwide, not just in wealthy Western markets. And that meant that we were going to see this extreme profusion of cheap devices, where every year, to the extent that Moore's law continued to play out, it meant that you could get more transistors per year per dollar, but that didn't translate into faster phones for most people. That translated into their first smartphone. And that meant that every year, the same capability got cheaper, and that just grew the market. And so it's only now, 2023, 2024, that we're starting to see full saturation, or replacement of what used to be the market for dumb phones being replaced by smartphones. Feature phone handsets were, as late as 2019, half of the entire market in India. And that has finally, rounded the bend. And so now we're in a place where folks are starting to get their second phones based on replacement rates and income worldwide. That's not like what it is maybe where we live, but the global reality is continuing to change. But that change for most of the last decade has meant that computers didn't get any faster. They stopped getting faster. And so our patterns and practices as a culture for people who were building on the web had been set. They sort of cemented in 2013 on this idea of CPUs get faster, networks always get faster, and that means we can afford more JavaScript every year. And that has created one gigantic branch mispredict. And that great branch mispredict in the sky has caused us sort of at a cultural level to make choices that are not compatible with actually delivering good experiences for most people, including people who are wealthy but just don't happen to be in the right time and place right now. And so it's been fascinating to see, this turn to excess and then hopefully away. But I'm excited about htmx and some of the patterns around it in that context.
Yeah, great points. I mean, it's this interesting irony where like all of a sudden, more people are accessing the web on mobile devices that have, much tougher constraints, especially in emerging markets, like you're saying. And we're also just kind of at the same time exponentiating the amount of JavaScript, right? Because we're like, oh, we want these rich experiences and this and that, but we're not really designing for, like, we talk about like mobile first design, we have responsive design, all this stuff, like, but like really, like we're not really designing for those experiences in the way that these apps perform in the wild, right? And so yeah, very excited to kind of like unpack the how we got here question with both of you today. And so Carson, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, right? So you've created this popular library based on this kind of core primitive of the web that I think most people don't know about. And when I say most people, I really mean like probably most of our listeners, most people writing JavaScript, right? This notion of kind of hypermedia and how you can leverage hypermedia to really just be talking in HTML, right? Like JSON has kind of been this language that we've, been using as this kind of like intermediary, right? Between servers and clients. And, it's like, oh, this universal language that, we can send over the wire and it doesn't really matter what the consumer is. It can be Swift, it can be Flutter, it can be JavaScript, like, all these different like every single programming language knows how to deal with JSON. And so it's like this universal connector, but at the same time, like it's, I think htmx and this pattern of like sending HTML back and forth over the wire, like it kind of highlights that like, hey, like maybe there isn't always a need for JSON, right? So yeah, can we talk a little bit about how we got here, and then we can kind of dig into some of the merits of htmx?
For sure. So I think one of my core ideas is that the web is hypermedia. The thing that made the web interesting at the start in any event was that hypermedia, it was a distributed hypermedia system. And there was a lot of thinking that went into that. There were a lot of new ideas, and it was something that was developed in reaction to the older sort of 1980s style thick clients. This idea, there's this thing that, if you're familiar with Roy Fielding, who I don't know how nerdy your listeners are, but he wrote a really famous dissertation sort of about the web back, in I think the late 90s. The design of the web and the way hypermedia works is it's designed such that there's a really strong decoupling between the client and the server. And the client here is defined as the web browser. And so one thing I try to stress to people is when they think about a web browser, even just take JavaScript out of the whole equation here and think about the fact that you have a piece of software on your device that can talk to a pet shop. It can talk to a car lot. You can reserve a hotel with it. You can get your news from it. And this one client that is sort of a universal client that's able to speak hypermedia is able to do all these things. And if you told someone in the 1980s that they would be using the same piece of software to pay their taxes, work with their bank, pay their utility bills, and do everything else, order their the food or the dinner for the evening, they would have looked at you cross-eyed, because that's just crazy. How could you have a client it just wouldn't have computed for those people. So I think that hypermedia, it was really exciting. I remember I was sort of like late in the game. I was very young when the web sort of hit, but looking back on it, you can see the excitement around this sort of different way of building software that was based on this notion of hypermedia. And just to give your listeners a definition of what hypermedia is it's something that has hypermedia controls in it. And hypermedia controls are things like links and forms. That's like if you're just talking about HTML. So links and forms. And what's special about links and forms, or what's interesting about them, is that they encode an interaction with a remote system within themselves. So when you get a web page from, some new website that you've gone to, the links and forms that are in that web page have the URLs and the interactions with that remote system baked into the HTML itself, baked into themselves. They're sort of self-contained remote, they contain the remote logic necessary to do the things that website wants to do. And that gets at something called the uniform interface from Roy Fielding's dissertation. But it's really that idea of hypermedia controls that's what defines a hypermedia in my estimation. And htmx, what it does is it generalizes that idea. It takes the two hypermedia controls most people are familiar with if they do web development, that is links and forms, and then generalizes it so that any element can effectively act as a hypermedia control.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because like hyperlink, which is like the kind of more like the actual name for like anchor tags and all these other things. I've never made that connection until hearing you explain this so well, Carson. But that is kind of like, that is the web, like, right? Like this like series of links and things that like redirect you to other primitives, and it doesn't really matter what's coming back on the other end. Like, it's going to be one of these three primitives, right? CSS, HTML, or JavaScript. And so Alex, can maybe dig into kind of this hypermedia protocol, right? Because like it is a web primitive, it is a web protocol. And so why are we not talking about this more often? And like how have browsers failed to maybe perhaps like expand on this protocol to enable like richer experiences?
Yeah, I think we don't talk about it as often in the web development community because we find that it's not something that we can personally influence, right? Aside from building or rebuilding large piles of it in JavaScript in userland, it's very challenging to imagine extending the vocabulary of the web in a kind of a way that's simpatico with the built-ins, because for many, many, many years it was fused shut, right? This was the instinct for us to develop web components in the first place. It's why you see there has been some intensity around forum participation for custom elements, that sort of thing. And I can report that it's finally here now that Safari is mildly off the fence, which is great. We're in a position now where some of these expansions of the vocabulary are sort of easier to imagine doing inside of the system. But for the longest time, you just had to rebuild everything, right? Between the constraints of legacy and the need to have control, for instance, of things like styling, the built-ins have not been the most simpatico way to try to get yourself a better version of a slightly upgraded version of that protocol whenever you want it. And so one way to think about this is we kind of migrated culturally into JavaScript out of partial necessity. And then I think beyond that, to some degree, we've stayed there out of storytelling and tribal identity. The narratives are strong and it's hard to, unseat them, especially when you think you can afford what you're doing and that everything is going fine. And if everything had been going fine, I wouldn't be spending any effort trying to unseat those narratives because, I've spent most of my career trying to make life better for JavaScript programmers too. But if your listeners are interested or curious about this, I'm fascinated by the progress that's being driven out of the OpenUI community group. They have had a big impact on the thinking of kind of finishing some of the things that we intended when we started the web components journey around making pieces of markup, existing form elements, existing types more extensible, or certainly from a styling and layout perspective. And there's more to do there about the data types that we encode underneath, right? Like that data type system is still a little bit fused shut in ways that I think are a little bit frustrating unless you go and build a form participating custom element today. But the good news is that the deltas that we need to apply on top of what the platform gives you in the 2024 moment are so much smaller than the deltas that we needed to apply previously, that I think it really will be a mind shift change. And I love what htmx is doing as a result.
Okay, so yeah, let's break that up a bit because there's a lot there. So the Open Web UI group that you referenced is this kind of standards working group that's trying to kind of create better, higher order components that are more what you would think of when you think of a React component or an Angular component or something, right? Like something richer and easier to work with.
Well, you might sort of work back through the justification process and say, why am I pulling in Angular or React or something? And the answer might be as simple as, well, I can't style my select box.
Right.
I would like it to be reactive, right? Because the built-in elements, they all have that kind of reactive belief about their own internal life cycles. That just hasn't been opened up to us. And so there's a fusing shut of the hood, so you can't go replace the bits that you want to get the change that you need. You have to build a whole new vehicle. And there's also the fact that the existing ones aren't very customizable, never mind serviceable.
Right.
They're pushing on both of those doors, and I think that's very helpful.
What's up, friends? I'm here with one of our good friends, Faraz Abukadije. Faraz is the founder and CEO of Socket. You can find them at socket.dev. Secure your supply chain, ship with confidence. But Faraz, I have a question for you. What's the problem? What security concerns do developers face when consuming open source dependencies? What does Socket do to solve these problems?
So the problem that Socket solves is when a developer is choosing a package, there's so much potential information they could look at, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they're trying to get a job done, right? There's a feature they want to implement. They want to solve a problem. So they go and find a package that looks like it might be a promising solution. Maybe they check to see that it has an open source license, that it has good docs. Maybe they check the number of downloads or GitHub stars. But most developers don't really go beyond that. And if you think about what it means to use a good package, to use a good open source dependency, we care about a lot of other things too, right? We care about who is the maintainer? Is this thing well maintained? From a security perspective, we care about, does this thing have known vulnerabilities? Does it do weird things? Maybe it takes your environment variables and it sends them off to the network, meaning it's going to take your API keys, your tokens. That would be bad. The unfortunate thing is that today, most developers who are choosing packages and going about their day, they're not looking for that type of stuff. It's not really reasonable to expect a developer to go and open up every single one of their dependencies and read every line of code. Not to mention that the average NPM package has 79 additional dependencies that it brings in. So you're talking about just thousands and thousands of lines of code. And so we do that work for the developer. So we go out and we fully analyze every piece of their dependencies, every one of those lines of code, and we look for strange things. We look for those risks that they're not going to have time to look for. So we'll find, we detect all kinds of attacks and kinds of malware and vulnerabilities in those dependencies, and we bring them to the developer and help them when they're at that moment of choosing a package.
Okay, that's good. So what's the install process? What's the getting started?
Socket's super easy to get started with. So our whole team is made up of developers, and so it's super developer friendly. We got tired of using security tools that send a ton of alerts and were hard to configure and just kind of noisy. And so we built Socket to fix all those problems. So we have all the typical integrations you'd expect: a CLI, a GitHub app, an API, all that good stuff. But most of our users use Socket through the GitHub app, and it's a really fast install. A couple clicks, you get it going, and it monitors all your pull requests, and you can get an accurate and kind of in-depth analysis of all your dependencies. Really high signal to noise. It doesn't just cover vulnerabilities. It's actually about the full picture of dependency risk and quality. Right? So we help you make better decisions about dependencies that you're using directly in the pull request workflow, directly where you're spending your time as a developer. Whether you're managing a small project or a large application with thousands of dependencies, Socket has you covered, and it's pretty simple to use. It's really not a complicated tool.
Very cool. The next step is to go to socket.dev, install the GitHub app, or book a demo. Either works for us. Again, socket.dev. That's socket.dev.
Anyone who's tried to style a form, like a native form, knows the pain of you can't get it to look the way you want it to look, and there's a lot of really great work that's been happening over the years, interop work with browsers and kind of improvements to form elements that, people have been working on, which is great. But yeah, we're still far away from, I think, what web developers need for that more turnkey experience that they're used to. So that's really exciting work. And so we talk about if the web had these components and we had richer kind of elements that could help us tell this hypermedia story, why do we even need something like JSON? That's what I want to try to understand, right? So if I can just have a conversation with my server in HTML, I don't have to go through this serialization process and blah, blah, blah. What's the need here for something like JSON at all?
Why are we using JSON? It's a good question, especially because HTML, HTTP has the name right in it. Why aren't we transferring HTML with this protocol? So, one of my assertions here is that one of the problems we ran into was that HTML sort of froze as a hypermedia. As far as the functionality, it wasn't taken forward as a hypermedia. And so you only had links and forms. Now, links and forms are very powerful. All of Web 1.0 was built with just links and forms, which is pretty amazing to think about. Just 2 hypermedia controls let us do all of that. Tremendous amount of wealth was generated, a tremendous amount of information was distributed, and so forth. But the fact is that HTML, really the form element, which was part of HTML2, was the last hypermedia control, and really the last part of HTML. It was the last time that HTML was moved forward as a hypermedia. There's other stuff, there's tons of other stuff that's happened to HTML, but almost all of it, or not almost all, but the vast majority of it is in terms of either client-side improvements or, you get things like the validation API, these things that didn't touch on the core idea of hypermedia controls. And so I think what happened there was that HTML stayed frozen, and that necessitated a certain level of usability, of user experience that was achievable with those hypermedia controls. And so because of that, almost out of necessity, everyone switched to JavaScript or went JavaScript heavy. And then when they went JavaScript heavy, the obvious thing to use was JSON. It's in there in the name, JavaScript object notation. So I think that's why we ended up with JSON, is because, I don't think it was a mistake. I just think it was, there was this unfortunate freeze in thinking about HTML. And what's really unfortunate about it is that there was thinking earlier on about, very early on, in the 70s and 80s, about this concept of transclusion, which is the idea of including one document in another document, that I think is really sort of the crux of what HTML does, or HTMX, I should say, does, because HTMX, by allowing you to have a hypermedia exchange where a piece of HTML comes back and then you place it inside an existing document. It really gives you a big boost in usability over plain links and forms because you don't lose scroll state. You get a huge amount of functionality, just a much smoother feeling that comes with building an application just with that one feature of htmx. And the concept was around for a long time. I actually wasn't familiar with it when I started making Intercooler, but I've come to go back and, read up a lot more on the early hypermedia discussions. And so it was there, but just for, reasons that sort of, I don't have the background to answer, HTML just kind of stopped. And so that ended up pushing people who wanted more usability into JavaScript. And then the natural communication medium was then, we adopted this thick client sense, like we're building thick applications. And so you're not going to use something like a hypermedia for that. You're going to use a data format. And JSON beat XML out, so JSON was the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, anything that's also a little bit closer to JavaScript, right, is there's gonna be less friction to kind of adopt that as well, like within code bases and whatnot. So I can see that as well. And so I think like this concept of transclusion, like for me, when I think about the web and especially like early web, right, like we're sharing documents and, there's just a bunch of links that lead to like other documents. And so like, just from a mental model, like that makes sense to me. Like HTML begets more HTML, like that makes sense. And so Alex, like you were kind of like smiling along when Carson said the word transclusion, and seems like you probably have some history with this. You want to let us in on that?
Yeah, one of the contributors to one of the earliest JavaScript toolkits that I worked on, something called Dojo, a guy named Brad Newberg, who is, I think, spending most of his time on ML topics these days. But I was lucky enough to work with for a while at Google. He got involved in a project, with Doug Engelbart trying to rebuild a piece of the system that they had imagined for hypertext early on. This is probably 2011, 12, but, working on ideas that had been husbanded by Doug Engelbart and his group from the 60s. And those transclusion ideas sort of made it into pieces of this work. And they are one of these things which is possible at the limit of our shared vocabulary and our shared performance, right? Like to the extent that we can afford to represent the same concepts in a document that's hosted on someone else's computer, then we get to do transclusions. And to the extent that we can't, we don't. I think it's fascinating rolling back all the way to the JSON idea. One way to think about this is why are we, in the footer of every document that's been SSR'd, quote unquote, why do we have a copy of those same exact semantics living as a JSON structure, which then gets rehydrated? I think that's probably what we mean by JSON, because this is actually the dumbest version of taking a local data model, right? Like the one and done local snapshot of a data model is like the dumbest version of that data model. And from the perspective of just going back and forth across several pages, like if you just go look at the structure of, I don't know, just to pick on anyone, a New York Times webpage. Just view source on a New York Times article. And if it doesn't make you laugh, you aren't looking hard enough because you get some HTML at the top and that HTML pulls in some JavaScript. And then if you scroll halfway down, you'll get to the bottom and it will have the same HTML as a JSON structure. Everything, literally everything as a JSON structure. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the way that we want to make those things interactive has to bootstrap onto some representation that is not the HTML. And so we don't actually share those HTML representations anymore. We've tried to abstract ourselves up off of HTML and into some other thing. And then we want to operate on that thing when we want to make changes and then splat it back out in some other way. And this is kind of, I think back to Carson's point about having some necessity driving this. Without the ability to upgrade the semantics of HTML, maybe because browsers get good at doing this again, although we don't have a great track record there, or because we have failed to bring along a system for doing it naturally ourselves, we wind up in this logic of building a parallel world and then having to reconcile it with the displayed reality, the thing that actually pumps our rendering system, the thing that actually takes the diffs and turns them into DOM diffs and turns them into CSS diffs against that and layout trees and then render trees and then raster, right? That whole flow requires that we pump it with something, and how far away we are from that core semantic model that it's designed to be pumped by is this tension that we feel. And that, I think, gets us into this question of like, well, why did we pile into the clown car of Web 2.0. And it's interesting to me that all of the examples that we bring up about where that stuff was truly revolutionary are systems that had many clicks or taps or drags, right? They had many detailed drilled in interactions per session. And it's in those places that local data model thing shines. And it's in the other places, which is, I'm just going to like hand wave and say, the vast majority of interactions on the web, where you have shallow sessions, whatever the designer's intent, where you aren't doing many clicks or taps against something that would be better if it was a local data model, that this stuff just feels like it feels like cruft, but we're not sure why, even though we have some innate belief that it's good for us, right? Because we're not looking at the diversity of session depth.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm surprised we've managed to get this far into the podcast without bringing up the word React. Like, I don't think we have. This is probably, I'm the first to bring it up. And I cannot wait to deconstruct React and like some of the paradigms with both of you, because really like there's just so much that doesn't feel natural, or that doesn't feel like, it feels like we're using the web all wrong, like we're like working against it, right? And the fact that like the React core team at one point was creating a scheduling API, which is, still part of core, I think, it's just mind boggling to think that we are trying to manage scheduling threads in JavaScript instead of just actually just working with the browser and like working with these primitives in a way that makes not only sense, but like it just greatly simplifies our code, and the complexity that we're managing as engineers, let alone the like benefit that it gives to users as well, right? Like that's what we're all trying to do. So I don't know, Alex, like this is kind of why I wanted to talk about like the how did we get here, right? Because using Angular and Backbone, over a decade ago, I'm talking about like Angular 1X, single page apps were just like so sexy to everyone. Like it was just like, ooh, and I don't know where we lost like sight of the complexity meter, and where we lost sight of like, does this make sense? And, and the other thing is like, clearly there's some standards gaps that also pushed us to this, right? Like, let's take ownership here on the platform side. Like, this is not just on web developers. Like, they were just trying to get stuff done to, to like ship things to their users. And so like, where did the platform fail us too, right? Because we can't put all this blame on web developers, right? Which are, by the way, world's smartest people. I'll argue that with anyone. But I think sometimes too smart for their own good, So I don't know. What are your thoughts, Carson?
Well, I think developers, they tend to underestimate the complexity of state synchronization in general. And one of the tremendous simplifying things about the web was the Web 1.0 model was that state was on the server, and you rendered a representation of the state, and that was it. And I remember when I first saw that, I had sort of a reaction against it too, because I had built some thick clients and, supported things like undo, which if there's one great simplification of web applications, it's that our users don't expect undo to work, because holy smokes, getting undo to work in a real thick client is not trivial. And so I think developers tend to underestimate that, tremendous simplification of distributed systems that the hypermedia model gave them. And they saw, this clunky user interface, and were like, man, we can do better than that. And they could. And so they got attracted to that. I think another dynamic, I know DHH, say what you will about the guy. He says interesting stuff. He said that, and he's kind of been on his own sort of riff on this, where he's saying, obviously he's been saying this for a while, but he's not he doesn't think single page application frameworks are as necessary as most people, or as a lot of people do. And he's got his own thing called Hotwire, which is in some ways very similar to htmx. And he said that a lot of this was sold. It was sales. People were selling stuff. There was a slick aspect to it, and I think there's something to that. I think that the broader dynamic, though, in technology is a fear of looking dumb. And I think it's really hard for people when someone comes in with a really complicated system and is like, look at this cool stuff that we can do, for someone to be like, man, that is crazy. maybe we don't need to do all that. Maybe could we do something dumb that's like an 80-20 solution to that? And that I think is the broader problem in the tech world that enabled us to go as far as we went. Again, I'm sympathetic because we work in an industry where your intellect is very highly valued, and appearing dumb can be very bad for your career prospects. And the reality is there are people who have been left behind in technology, like Perl developers, in 1998 didn't see the Java meteor coming at them. And if they stuck with Perl and didn't, get on the Java bandwagon or go over to PHP or whatever, they ended up really limiting their careers. So it's just a dynamic that I think you have to acknowledge about the technology world.
Yeah, no, that's like so well said. And by the way, are you just trying to score points or something, Carson? Because like listeners on the show know how I beat that simplicity drum a lot. And I beat the like 80-20 trade-off like a lot. Like in the sense that like everything you just said, right? Like all these incentives that we have as engineers, like to be smart, work on hard problems, be the hero, crush it, yada, 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 be the bus factor. Like, cause I really do think some people strive to be the bus factor. Like, and like, bus factor being, to explain this, it's like, being an invaluable person to your company or team, right? Where you're the only one who knows this esoteric code and you're the only one who can touch it. And if somebody makes it, like they have to call you at 3 a.m. to make an edit or approve a PR or whatever, I do feel like there's a little bit of fetishization of that like person, that persona, and we are not incentivized towards simplicity. And for me, this is like a leadership problem, like in terms of like our engineering leadership, like our engineering leadership should be incentivizing simplicity because that's just better for everyone on all fronts, but here we are in this complexity race and it's like a race to the bottom, which is where we are now. I feel like things are so complicated in JavaScript. Like it's so hard for new people to come in and write modern web applications. Like when I say modern web applications, it's quote unquote modern web applications that are using popular tools and technologies, right? Like a little hello world, like you have to learn how to use a bundler. You have to learn how to, potentially use TypeScript because the examples are all in TypeScript. Like whatever it is, like there's all of these like barriers to entry because we've just like, I don't know what it is. Like maybe we're just trying to prove to everyone that like JavaScript is a serious programming language, or I don't know what it is, but this like Napoleon syndrome needs to go. Like because it's hurting the web, like literally hurting the web, And Alex, I see you laughing, so please chime in.
Well, I would just cut the question of why are we doing all of this complexity and how did we get here by trying to always challenge it by saying who are we tackling all this complexity for? Right? Like there's a version which I think, Carson, your point about people's hiring prospects gets to, which is to say that there is always and will always be some aspect of this which is about looking over your own back, right, for yourself. And there's some aspect of this which I think is a little bit more inspirational, and I hope more aspirational, which is to say we're going to go make this get better for everyone. And getting better for everyone is not about making it better for just me or people who are just like me or who are in the same situated, physical geography or in the same situated socioeconomic bracket, right? Those are questions about who do we want to have served looking back from our future selves. And I think if I was just going to characterize today's technology landscape, I would say that it is, and this is not an indictment of any individual, but it is an extremely selfish enterprise, right? It has bought into kind of a libertarian trickle-down developer experience idea, and it's just as falsifiable today in the evidence that we're getting from INP and all the rest as it ever was in the data, in the 80s from some various tax experiments, right? Like these things, these are ideas that don't work as well today as they didn't work in the past. And we don't have to keep trying them, right? We don't have to keep believing in trickle-down DX. We can just say that the way that you make something better for the user is to focus on the user, and that the problems that are worth solving are the problems that we can identify being as problems that users face rather than problems that we face. And yes, we can also say, in a very cross-pressured way, that it is important to solve problems for ourselves so that we can get to problems for users, right? Like this kind of developer experience bait and switch operates on the kernel of truth that there is something there that is so valuable that if we solve it, we will have also solved problems for users along the way. But I would just say that we have got so much evidence now of not marking those ideas to market along the way. And that when we don't do that, it turns out that it's just a bezel, right? It's just a failure that we don't account for yet. And we can call them out as such in the future, right? We don't have to keep pretending that the next thing that the React team ships is going to solve anything, because it actually isn't phrased in terms of solving something for the end user. So if it's not phrased in terms of solving something for the end user, to a first approximation, it doesn't matter. And at a second order effect, we definitely need some evidence to show that it's actually going to move the needle for us, right? And like, if we don't have that evidence, then a la Hitchens' razor, we just get to throw it out. We just get to ignore it the way we should have ignored it all along.
Yeah, I mean, and standing ovation, like, it's not a fake clap, it's a real clap. I'm just gonna, okay, seriously, yes. Also, how much of this do you think is a leadership problem? Because like, I like, as an engineering leader now myself, I am like, holy moly, like, I'm like, I need to start blogging and I need to start helping these other engineering leaders like learn how to set some darn standards. You know what I mean? Set some absolutely. Damn standards for your team.
100%.
So can we talk about that?
Yeah, and I want to put responsibility where it belongs. I don't want me to say that, the enthusiasms of engineers are things that we should like pin industry-wide failure on. Like, that's not true, right? There's a lot of technology that I love that hasn't taken off and probably never will. And I just have to like be sad about that. That's okay. But, I wish it was different in some ways. But also, managers have responsibilities in these environments. And if anyone is supposed to be asking the question of who are we doing this for, who does it benefit, setting benchmarks that help you do it, setting up environments where we can make that legible and visible, like the overlap between teams that I consult with, and I do a lot of consulting with teams here at Microsoft to dig us out of the ditches that we have reliably put ourselves in with regards to performance on the web. The number of teams that actually need the kind of help that we can provide from the browser side, and the overlap in those teams between folks who have done bake-offs to find out what actually works for the user, right? Like, it's a Venn diagram in the style of two circles that don't touch. Folks who do bake-offs, managers who are wise enough to put the user into the calculus up front and then make sure that they stay there, or that they've got the kind of metrics that they need to do it, they generally don't have these problems. Now, that's not true. You can get yourself into a place where you've got such a large organization that it's hard to, contain any of these effects. But the difficulty in containing those effects is a core argument for stack simplicity in the first place, right? Because, I've written a bit in the last couple of years about what I've called the performance management maturity kind of cliff that you have to scale as a team. And if you've got simpler technology, your problems are generally simpler on the other side of trying to solve a problem a particular way. Now, you might resent things about that stack, but it didn't leave you with the most complex problems as a residual kind of side effect of doing the work. Whereas if you buy into complex stacks, or stacks that leave you with complexity up front, or try to hide complexity from you, you own all of it on the other side anyway. And now your problems are more complex and your solutions actually take much longer to execute. So teams that get beached or stranded are teams that have bought into stacks that they don't actually manage, and the outputs of those stacks manage them. And that's the worst place to be. And so this is a management maturity problem.
And that's where a lot of people are now, right? Like, They're just on this like bandwagon where I'm like looking at some of the new things that are coming out of React, and I'm like, whoa, man, like I wouldn't want to be stuck on that roadmap, having to upgrade and start using some of those patterns. So like, but anywho, all right. So we're going to come back to some of this stuff because as we kind of do some compare and contrasts, because there's kind of a lot more to unpack here. But, since we've been focused on rendering patterns and the how do we get here problem, let's just shift into htmx, Carson. So this is going to be like this quickest part of this discussion because I think it's such a simple framework. It's going to be like super easy to explain it. It's going to be like 3 minutes and then we're done. We can all go home.
Sure.
But why don't you just like lay the groundwork for us? So, qu'est-ce que ça? What is htmx?
Okay, so htmx, the way to think about htmx is it's a few attributes. There's probably 10 to 12 core attributes, and really there's only like 5 or 6 that can get you started. And those attributes are HTML attributes. So you put them on HTML elements. And what they do is they generalize the idea of hypermedia controls, which is a nerdy way of saying they make elements do things over the network. And so just as an example, if you have a button and you want that button to issue a put to /liked, then you put an attribute on that button that's called hxPut. And you say hxPut equals and then /liked. And that's similar in many ways to what you would put on, an anchor tag. You would have an href, and that would tell the browser when someone clicks on this, load that whole page in. So when you put that hxPut on a button, what that's going to htmx, which is JavaScript, which looks for that attribute and then hooks up an event listener. What htmx is going to do is it's going to issue a request to that endpoint, and then that endpoint is going to return HTML. And that's really the crux. That's the really major difference between, thinking about things in a JavaScript-centric world and the HTMX approach. These are what I call hypermedia exchanges. We're making a request to the server and we're getting back hypermedia. And so then the question becomes, okay, I've issued this request, I've gotten back hypermedia, where do I put it? We've already talked about transclusion, and so HTMX has a few attributes. One's called hxSwap and one's called hxTarget. The hxTarget attribute uses a CSS selector, which hopefully web developers are familiar with, to pick an element in the DOM to put this content into. And then the hxSwap attribute lets you tell HTMX how to put that into the DOM. So maybe you want to put it inside the element. Maybe you want to replace the element. So that's like the outer HTML. Maybe you want to put it after the element and so forth. There's a few different options there. And so that's really the crux is, those attributes. There's the one other attribute, the one other generalization of HTMX is that there's an attribute called hxTrigger, which lets you pick which event causes an HTTP request to occur. And so, all those attributes come together to generalize the idea of hypermedia controls, and they let you implement more rich applications within the hypermedia model. So a good practical example, and I would encourage your listeners to go to htmx.org/examples, because that probably doesn't sound like very much, and it's not. That's kind of the idea. But despite that fact, you can actually do quite a bit with HTMX. Some user patterns that UX patterns, I should say, that most people wouldn't expect. Those very simple, or not trivial, but still, it's not a big step beyond plain HTML and the hypermedia controls we're already used to. So to give you a simple example, this is one of my favorite examples because it's two attributes. But if you had a web page that had a chunk of it that was taking a while to render, so you had some component, say a graph, for example, that took a little bit to render, and you wanted to render it on a web page. With HTMX, what you could do is you could take a div and you could put hxTrigger equals load on that. So trigger the request when this div loads, and then you could point the URL, you could say hxGet from /graph. And then what you could do is you could move that complicated graph computation out to another endpoint and remove it from the first paint of that initial web page. So maybe that graph isn't super important. Maybe there's other actions you want the user to be able to do. But these two attributes, hxTrigger equals load and then hxGet equals /graph, allow you to take this piece of HTML and move it out to another endpoint and have the initial page, because it's able to use transclusion, do a first paint without that content. And so that's an example. This lazy loading it's a great perf win. It can get users to a user interface they can interact with a lot more quickly. And if I first talk to you, when most people first start looking at HTMX, it wouldn't occur to them that they could do a pattern like that with this concept. And so for whatever reason, I just love that example because I've used it very effectively in a lot of web applications to make a particular page faster.
Yeah. Oh my God. So that's super cool and wow. And that kind of partial loading, I feel like JavaScript developers have kind of recreated that with the islands architecture a little bit. If you're familiar, Carson, where we are able to kind of do this graceful, lazy loading by kind of drawing boxes around different parts of our app. But here, like, we can do that very simply and cleanly using htmx's like ability to use transclusion, like, duh, like, it's so duh. It's like, huh? Okay, so let's talk about this, like, Ajax with attributes. So first of all, I want to say congrats on like being probably one of the best marketers, I think, of a library framework. I don't even know who does your marketing, if it's you or if you people from the community, but y'all have some awesome marketing, like your Twitter pictures.
It's literally just me.
It's you? Okay, well, you're awesome. And like, if I ever have a library that I want to go viral, like, I know who I'm coming to.
I have no idea what I'm doing.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, so can we talk about Ajax with attributes, right? So, folks, many folks are probably familiar with like data attributes as a thing on HTML elements, right? But now you have all this other stuff, and because HTML has this like very graceful extensibility, right, where you can have all these custom like attributes, you're able to like leverage that, similar to like somebody might say a prop, right? But these props are like a bit more specific. So can we talk a little bit about this? Like, how big is this API that you have for like these built-in attributes? And can you give us some examples of some?
Yeah, it's not very big because there's really, so when I think about hypermedia controls, I think about 4 areas where they can be generalized. So if you think about like a link or a form, really what makes them, their essence from a hypermedia standpoint is that an event occurs. In the case of the link, it's a click, or in the case of a form, it's a submit. And then a request is issued. And then that response is used as a document to replace the whole page. And so the generalizations there are, okay, let's let other elements issue those requests. Let's let any event trigger that request. Let's let any type of request be made. One of the sort of tragedies of HTML is that in the standard hypermedia controls, you can only issue gets and posts, but HTTP has, put and patch and delete, which these all have, meanings, and it's a shame that you can't access them directly from HTML. And then finally, that last one, which is instead of replacing the whole document, let's make it possible to do transclusion, a flexible transclusion mechanism. And those attributes boil down to hx get through delete. So, hx get, post, patch, put, and delete. Hx trigger, which is the event, and then hx target and swap, which is sort of how to transclude the content that came back into the DOM. And so and for better or for worse, I tend to use just hx get. You can use data-hx get if you want to be a better web citizen. I don't know how Alex feels about that, but I've always just kind of used I sort of like how sloppy the web is.
That's never mattered, and it will never matter.
Okay, there, perfect. An adult has said it doesn't matter. I love it.
So I would just say that whether or not you use a data dash prefix in terms of attribute names has never practically mattered. I can see the case for why it might. We've had cases in the JavaScript standard where people have sort of camped out on global names, and that's been challenging to introduce things in. But we have not, as far as I know, run into a case of that happening with data attributes or non-data prefixed attributes.
That's awesome. That's great context. And so I'm just amazed at how you have just such a simple API, like simple interface, but it's so powerful, right? Because it's really like, it's the stuff that it's, what are we doing on the web? We're sending back a bunch of actions, put, delete, get, post, and we're updating information on a screen based on the results of those actions, And here now we have this framework or this library that allows you to do that gracefully and elegantly with HTML. And for me, like, the beauty of HTML is, it can handle structural complexity very well, And then with that structural complexity, if you do it well, you also get nice semantics and nice ways of organizing your code. And for me, the best part about kind of moving more towards an HTML first world is that we now get to say hello to a bunch of other classes. Like, we've lost a class of developers, over the past 10, 15 years. We had CSS and HTML experts that we've kind of shoved to the corner in this JavaScript first world. And I miss those folks. Those folks are amazing. Those folks know HTML better than we do as JavaScript developers. Those folks know CSS better than we do as JavaScript developers. Those folks know how to write accessible experiences, right, that are performant and clean and organized. And I feel like we've kind of, I don't know, like we've just shoved them aside. And I hope that this is like our new reality of focusing more on HTML, right? Because I'm excited to welcome back that class of developer, right? That's not super into JavaScript, but is into the other two big primitives of the web. I see you nodding heavily, Alex.
Oh yeah, I think there's a fire sale on talent right now. And if you were going to try to determine whether or not someone who was sort of, I would say, given the median level of familiarity with CSS versus the median level of familiarity with JavaScript, who's going to turn out the better experience for most users, I would give it to the CSS expert or journeyman every single time. Just because most experiences are not composed of the kinds of extremely deep sessions that require us to pile into the JavaScript clown car. We don't need that local data model to operate against with low latency, with speculative application of data model diffs, if we aren't going to keep the page around forever. So in most cases, you want to hire people to solve problems with HTML and CSS with as little JavaScript as possible, not to pay them to make new problems with JavaScript.
This is a Changelog news break. Curl creator / maintainer Daniel Stenberg documents his frustration with recent AI tooling advancements. Quote, I have held back on writing anything about AI or how we do not use AI for development in the Curl factory. Now I can't hold back anymore. Let me show you the most significant effect of AI on Curl as of today with examples. End quote. Daniel is clearly of the opinion that we haven't gained much of value from generative AI tooling, but he does seem more optimistic about the future than he is about the present. Quote, I am convinced there will pop up tools using AI for this purpose that actually work better in the future, at least part of the time. So I cannot and will not say that AI for fighting security problems is necessarily always a bad idea. I do, however, suspect that if you just add an even so tiny intelligent human check to the mix, the use and outcome of any such tools will become so much better. I suspect that will be true for a long time into the future as well. End quote. My mind is open and willing to be changed, but I'm with Daniel here. The human touch is absolutely necessary today, and I suspect that will remain the case for much longer than some would have us to believe. You just heard one of our 5 top stories from Monday's Changelog News. Subscribe to the podcast to get all of the week's top stories and pop your email address in at changelog.com/news to also receive our free companion email with even more developer news worth your attention. Once again, that's changelog.com/news.
Let's actually get into that a little bit because I want to talk about this session and types of web apps, right? Because we've kind of danced around this a little bit, and this kind of data model that's kind of conscious of like session time, right? And like architecture that's conscious of like how long are people spending on this site, right? For example, Netflix's login page, I remember this was a fun story. Like they rewrote their login and sign up page like just in HTML and CSS, and they removed React because it was just too slow, right? And so like why did they do that? Well, they were optimizing for performance, and hey, we don't want to make people feel like it's taking too long to sign up or log in, So, that's smart. Let's optimize for that, right? So let's like have more of a static architecture so that we can, meet our users as quickly as possible so we don't lose them to another tab or another, like a TikTok video or whatever, right? So that's one. But like, can we talk a little bit about this, like these different types of architectures and session depth? And like, I'm also curious to hear from you, Carson, like when is htmx not a good idea for the thing that you're trying to do, right?
Sure.
So
Alex, you want to go first here?
Go for it.
Okay, well, the idea of session depth, I learned about it a couple days ago, and I feel like I'm not in a great spot to talk about that particular way of looking at things. But the way I look at things is sort of what Alex was getting at earlier, where if you have a bunch of events that need to drive interactivity, then hypermedia is a bad idea. Roy Fielding said this. He said, it's designed for what he called coarse-grain hypermedia interactions. And so if you're trying to respond...
And who's Roy Fielding? Fielding? Just
Roy Fielding, being the guy who wrote his dissertation, sort of formed the basis.
the dissertation guy. Okay.
Yeah, he's the dissertation guy. That he gave us the term REST and hagios, if you've heard that term. So hypermedia is the engine of application state.
I've always called it hatos. Is it hatios?
I don't know, hagios. It's a bad acronym. He actually prefers the term the hypermedia constraint. So that would probably be better for everyone involved.
Yeah, I speak too many languages to. Nobody should trust my pronunciation on anything because I'm multilingual, and so whatever,
But I think Alex's point that, if you have a lot of interactions, that, you can't put a hypermedia exchange in between those interactions. And, you mentioned earlier the idea of this island architecture. To me, one of the missing links in the discussions around a lot of these things is the notion of events, like having an island of interactivity, be it a web component or whatever, something that does or gives a richer experience, but then that integrates with a broader hypermedia system using what are hopefully not super frequent events. If someone gets a rich text editor, that's an amazing piece of software, an amazing extension to the web. Maybe they put Markdown in it or whatever it is, and then they click a save button, and okay, now an event occurs that triggers a bigger hypermedia exchange where that Markdown is sent to the server and rendered into HTML and placed somewhere else in the document or whatever it is. And so just to give your listeners an idea of what HTMX wouldn't be a good idea for, it would not be a good idea for Google Maps. I don't think it would be very difficult to make Google Maps work well with HTMX. It would be difficult to make Google Sheets work well with HTMX because you have a lot of very crazy dependencies. You can't afford to just sort of replace parts of the DOM. But one thing I often say is that on the other hand, those two applications probably have settings pages that could use HTMX, where you're much closer to the standard form. Where you've got some checkboxes and this and that's sort of wheelhouse for the web. And so I don't think it's an either or necessarily, but there's definitely the more fine grained your event handling needs to be, the less ideal the hypermedia infrastructure is going to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary, and I think for me, you're just reinforcing this notion for me that it's okay to have different parts of your app be architected differently, right? Like optimize for each experience, using the best tool for the job. It doesn't have to be one size fits all.
It doesn't have to be one size fits all. That's right. I have taken, in some of these cases, to working with teams to break down their apps into different experiences. So I think the one that we may be most familiar with is, maybe a blogging piece of software. WordPress is probably a good example. So WordPress has a viewing mode, right? And that is a query against the database or a bunch of different queries against the database nested with some templating, and it spits some stuff out. And the set of interactions that each of the viewers who go to each of the responses from those queries has about that content is extremely shallow. Those are shallow sessions. And they're mostly scroll. And scroll is handled by the browser, so they don't count in your total denominator number of interactions, right? So if you think about the number of interactions that we're counting here, the interaction where you clicked on a link or typed in a URL or tapped on something to get to it, that's the first one. So you get to a 1 to start. And every subsequent interaction in the session is another added to the denominator, but scrolls don't count. So if we take that as our model, viewing a piece of content and maybe scrolling down it, it's one interaction, right? Whereas the editor for a blog post inside of WordPress or something else, that's going to be hundreds, thousands of interactions, right? Like you're typing, right? You're doing this stuff. And one way of maybe testing this theory is, could you benefit from having a local copy of the data model and having it sync up with a server? So to the extent that that makes good sense from a sort of user latency perspective and from a user experience perspective of the total end-to-end experience, should I have a CRDT or should I have replicache in my architecture, is kind of this. But you can disaggregate a lot of these applications and say it's got a viewing mode, in which case the denominator is 1 or maybe less than 5 on average. And then you've got an editing mode, and that editing mode is a much more sophisticated application, which may benefit from, having a local offline copy of your stuff so you can modify and edit your stuff and sync it later. And in the multiplayer version, be able to do that stuff too. So kind of disaggregating some of these applications is a pro move, but also just thinking about it from a top level perspective of who are my users, who is my median session, who's my P95 session, how deep are their sessions? And if their sessions are pretty shallow, every e-commerce site has basically, it yearns for deep sessions, but they're generally pretty shallow. If they're generally pretty shallow, then the denominator that you can divide the costs per interaction on is low. And so if you think about this in terms of, the ideal architecture serving you up only the delta in what you need when you need it, per interaction style, to get to the lowest total cost per interaction over the amortized session depth, then you're getting into a place where you can start to make these kinds of trade-offs. We don't do that today with these things. We sort of kind of eyeball it and go, I don't know, smells like an app. But, most things aren't. Most things just aren't apps. They aren't apps in that style of like having deep sessions, which again kind of reinforces our intuition that things like stuff that need lots of scrolling and panning in any session to be moderately useful, like maps, probably need more infrastructure on the client versus things that, we could offload more to the runtime for us to do.
Right, like the VS Code in the browser, Google Maps, Gmail, right? Like these like things where, you have like deep sessions and you have a ton of interactions and it's too expensive to kind of do those round trips. And so for that case, it's like have a local data model, have like an architecture for kind of syncing like as often or as infrequent as makes sense for that application. And, for things like your shopping websites and for things where, everyone has this fantasy of people spending hours and hours on their application, right? Like, but like really,
Yeah, and you can investigate your logs. You can find out whether or not people spend hours and hours in your application.
Yeah, yeah. Use data to make that decision to figure out how long are people actually on your site or on that page,
It won't surprise you to find out that a lot of these things, again, they've got multiple humps. They've got their multimodal distributions. Working with the Word team in their data know that some large fraction of sessions are basically viewer sessions. They look like reading a blog post, but it's also an editing interface, which means that they can, for people who are going to do long editing sessions, afford to load up a bunch of stuff. But most people aren't, so they can't. Right. So the overriding concern, because you don't know who's who about most documents when you load them up.
But wouldn't this be like and by the way, when you say Word team, Alex is talking about like the Microsoft Word team. And so, for example, with Microsoft Word, wouldn't that be an opportunity to kind of break up that experience into two paths where you have like a read path and an edit path? And by default, you assume that everyone's just doing a read. And then when they decide to do an edit, you flip over, or you use that time, you use some background process to kind of like buy you some time while people are in read mode to get ready for edit mode or whatever it is. Like, I'm just saying, like, wouldn't something like that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And those are, there's a range of tools you can employ to make that mode switch more gradual. But it's really, I think, informative to be thinking about what the costs are for most users first and foremost, rather than to fetishize your most engaged user. Because your most engaged user is going to be super valuable to you. But if you're not taking care of most of the people who are using your service most of the time, then you're failing by default, right? Like, so you got me back to this question of like, what is the project manager, engineering manager's job in this? It's to ask, who are we doing this for? And then what does it mean to succeed? And then to phrase that as a series of metrics that get pushed back to the engineering organization to say, these are the things that we're going to drive up. And if you're not phrased in terms of user success, again, your organization is just going to be, a stop clock. It's write twice a day, but not more frequently than that.
Yeah, no, that write twice a day, but not more frequently than that. That's so funny. Yes, and yes. And I would say for me, like, there's an education gap. Like it's a knowledge and skills gap here. And on multiple fronts, for example, on the engineering side, we don't have enough kind of discourse dialogue examples of, multi-architecture applications, right? So like, how do I support these different paradigms under one code base, in one monolith or whatever it is, right? So that's one. The other thing is like on the engineering leadership and product management side, there's, just gaps, and I think in the way that we work, which like don't really make space for this kind of data-driven decisioning, right? And like, here's some targets that we want to set, and kind of this kind of obsession with the user, like, and so I mean, honestly, Alex, I feel like you and I should work together to like either write a bunch of blog posts or like do a bunch of talks, on this topic, really, because I think this is something that, needs to be taught, and it needs to be part of the wider discourse, and it's just not. Can you give me an example of who's doing this well? like outside of Microsoft and Google, places that you've worked?
I mean, doing which well?
Oh, like this kind of setting benchmarks and, targets and using analytics to kind of help drive architecture decisions and so forth.
So most of the teams that I see who eventually get to a place where their systems are, and I want to talk about this in terms of, not in terms of like which technologies you pick, but in terms of whether or not you are managing the technology versus whether the technology is managing you. A lot of teams, this never comes up in because they pick simple enough technologies that like they maybe have to fix some image loading or encoding issues somewhere along the lines, or maybe something went sideways with the font, at least in terms of performance, or your problems will be just as simple with accessibility because you know, to Carson's point, piled into HTML rather than rebuilding the entire universe on top of a very small footprint of the JavaScript runtime compared to the completeness of the rest of the platform by default for you. And so lots of teams end up with very small problems and they fix them quietly, and we don't tend to talk about them. The teams that I end up spending most of my time with are teams that have gotten themselves into the ditch, and they get themselves there on good intentions. No one's trying to do a bad job. No one's trying to do the wrong thing for the user. It's just that the user was not put front and center through the entire requirement process. And pulling back from that requires management support, right? If you just do it as an engineer, if you just try to roll the boulder up the hill, you will feel like Sisyphus at the end, because without management support, it's going to be rough. So the places that have fixed this are, like I've seen great results out of Wix, right? They had a many-year remediation challenge where they had bought into the usual React nonsense, and that tanked their metrics. And then they got management support to go fix it. And then that turned into many years of not shipping features, but instead fixing the stuff that they had meticulously broken with way too much JavaScript. And then at the end of it, you end up with the infrastructure that you would have needed to keep any piece of technology in line, right? Teams that have climbed the management maturity mountain can manage anything. Teams that have not climbed it will be done in by anything but the simplest technology. So from a management capacity perspective, the real magic is to marry the simplicity of the solution to the capacity of the organization and its willingness to spend on keeping the complexity in check. So that means that the pro move for every manager who's looking at a new project is to do a bake-off, because it's going to cost you a lot less to spend the time to actually try stuff, to set up some pro user and pro marginal user metrics that you can judge against, and then to pick the simplest thing from your set of potential available options, right? The most option value that you get is the option value of not having to be dead in the water for 6 months while you try to remediate something that's on fire, like I've seen dozens of teams do. People talk about like, oh, well, if we do this, then we could do all of that. Do you remember? I don't know if you ever saw Arrested Development, like
Of course.
I think that was like the one Netflix only season.
Oh, I haven't finished the Netflix only season.
They're buying a house, and the conversation with a circa 2007 mortgage broker goes, well, if you have the extra bedroom, then you've got it. And they look to each other and go, oh yeah, then we've got it. And that's kind of how I think, Carson, to your point earlier about how we've got this aspirational complexity budget in our heads, which is much larger than our execution stomachs are. Those eyes are outmatched by what we can actually handle. And that turns into a bad time, predictably. So it's the role of managers to keep that in check.
Yeah, here. And we're going to link, there's going to be a lot of links in the show notes, everyone, like a lot. Like actually, Alex, like while we're in this discussion, this is how I'm like, I want to know if Alex is human or not, because I'm like, I know typical human being is not capable of like doing two things at once. He's literally like talking and sending us links at the same time. I'm just like, what's going on? Do you like, but we have a ton of links from Alex. But the visual that, I really want you all to see is this like lovely diagram that he put together around interaction depth and, the local data models. And anyways, it's pretty cool. So check that out. And I think for me, the cherry on the cake here is that like, we are starting to wake up to this, slowly but surely. Like, I think people are starting to see that, like, the world that we're in is like, this is not sustainable, right? And you can't have a Ferrari. You can have an appetite for a Ferrari, but you can't be driving a Ferrari when you have like a Corolla budget. You know what I mean? And that is most teams. Most teams like don't have that Ferrari budget. And I think your blog post, Alex, Market for Lemons, which we talked about last time we had you on the show, which was, web development's kind of lost decade. I think that's what the show was called. we talked about how, one of your frustrations has been that like, hey, for example, tools like React aren't upfront about how much infra and maintenance and time you need to spend on pruning and maintaining and blah 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 blah. It's not just it doesn't just come for free, right? So your whole point was like, hey, like be honest about this stuff so people can make informed decisions. But the problem is like we have this like hype cycle, hype train, whatever, and no one wants to go against that. Like it's actually like I feel so sorry for like the engineering managers that have to even talk about tools that are not React with their directors or their engineers or their ICs, because it's like, well, like why would we use something that's not React? React is going to be easy to hire for. There's all these existing open source things, blah 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 blah, and so like there's this like that's the argument that I think a lot of people are like coming up against,
These are all nonsense arguments, by the way. I don't mean that in the sense of like they are not marginally true or that there's not a kernel of truth in them. It is possible to find lots of resumes that say React on them. But the idea that someone has made it to the end of the journey of putting all of the just totally useless stuff that you have to learn to sort of make a React app go, that person can't also learn HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, or get their hands around the platform or pick up htmx. That idea it's insulting to the people that you would hire.
It's true.
And it's so dumb that it really makes you think less of the person saying it, because they obviously haven't thought hard about this claim either. So it's a dead idea, and we can call it dead, and we can call it, unacceptable in conversation, because it doesn't ever come with evidence other than there are a lot of resumes that say this. But I can tell you right now, we just put out a rec for some web components developers, and a lot of these people say, oh, well, we couldn't possibly hire for those skills. And my intuition has been, well, that means you're not looking. But now that, we've just put out some web components recs for a team that I work with on design system side at Microsoft, I can tell you people are coming out of the woodworks for this stuff. You can hire for whatever skill you're willing to pay for. So if you're willing to pay for platform fundamentals and then little sprinkling of JavaScript with htmx, or platform fundamentals and then a little sprinkling of web components, or whatever your flavor of the month is for a little sprinkling of JavaScript, I promise you those people are available. I promise you they're awesome. And they're not going to reach for things that are going to create a larger problem than they solve most of the time. You'll actually get better culturally aligned values out of that population than you would by sort of the usual thing that people claim that they must have.
One thing you mentioned earlier, that class of they're web developers, but they were CSS and HTML specialists to an extent. It overlapped with design, and they got kind of pushed aside by the JavaScript world. And I do have to say, because I don't live in React, I don't have the same negative vibes that you and Alex have towards it. And obviously HTMX is a different approach to things. But one thing I do want to say to especially listeners for JS Party is like, I would like to see HTMX de-escalate the language here. Like, there's not a silver bullet that's coming from the React team. HTMX is not a silver bullet. The web platform is good for some things and it's bad for other things. And it would be amazing if we could get to a point where we could discuss those in a mature way without, saying, okay, this will never work. Well, it can be made to work. I've seen bad design decisions be made to work. And if people could, especially listeners of JS Party could look at this as like, this is another tool. I can use it to save complexity here. And the irony of HTMX for many JavaScript developers is that it actually makes the value per line of JavaScript that you write much higher, because you're writing a lot less JavaScript. You're saving JavaScript for those high value spots where it's important to get it right for the user. And you leverage the platform for the other stuff. Like, it's kind of a waste of the power of JavaScript to use it to get a form into a database. Like, that's not what it was designed to do. It was designed to help, again, Roy Fielding, the guy who wrote that dissertation, said that the scripting is there in order to provide functionality that the platform doesn't already have. And so, okay, make drag and drop work. for elements on an HTML page. That's something that is not baked into the browser, and that's a great use, an amazing use of JavaScript that makes the user experience significantly better. Use it for something like that, and again, the value that you derive per line of JavaScript written goes up significantly. So sometimes, you see this, and it's true, there are people who really hate JavaScript and love HTMX because they don't have to write any JavaScript. But the truth is, to use JavaScript as effectively as possible, you have to understand the platform, and JavaScript is part of that platform. And so there's an opportunity. One thing I've said is that I think that the most effective HTMX users 5 years from now will be people who really understand the web platform in its entirety, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, and who also have a strong sense of what they can accomplish on the back end. I often say in SQL, but in SQL is just a stand-in for whatever back end technology. But I think there's an opportunity, and that would allow some of the people who've been pushed aside because their knowledge is mainly CSS and HTML. HTMX also boosts the relative value of HTML and CSS because it takes out this layer of junk you need to deal with to make those effective for modern user experiences. So it's just something especially being on JS Party, I want to mention. I don't want HTMX to be viewed as the anti-JavaScript framework. It will to some extent because of the way it's set up, but I really do think that, again, it drives up the value per line of JavaScript that good JavaScript developers who know the platform well can achieve.
Yeah, so well said, Carson, and thanks for that excellent point. I mean, you have to understand, Alex and I have been ranting. We have a text thread. We have threads on different platforms, I should say, but we've been ranting about this stuff for years, right? So I think it's you get two salty people together that have been ranting about this, and it makes it sound like the opposite of what you said, but yes to what you said. And I think we're both definitely aligned with that. And I would say that I want to make sure that Alex, I think his point about React specifically, it's not that it can't work. It's just that you need all these other things to make it work in the way that you think it should work or could work, right?
Yeah, and if you're happy to pay that cost,
yeah,
then your team is paying full freight. The place that I spend a lot of my time and therefore have a departure in experience with maybe some other folks is that I spend a lot of time with teams who are having a terrible time. And because of the kind of toxic positivity bubble in the JavaScript community for the last decade around a lot of this complexity, we haven't talked honestly about those costs. And that means that teams get ambushed by those costs. And that's bad for the teams, and it's bad for the products, and it's bad for the end users. And I care about all those constituencies. So it's not this can't work. Like you said, Carson, you can push a lot of bad ideas a long way with enough effort. It's just that I want us to get to a place where we're having an engineering conversation around that delta in both cost and capability, rather than sort of, reiterating a bunch of old wives' tales about how it could possibly go when we have more data available to us.
Yeah, totes. And I think one discussion that we are not going to have time to really dig into here, but I would advise everyone to go listen to the interview that Carson did with the GoTime team. We'll link that. I think it's episode 266 around kind of the full stack developer, right? I want to have that conversation with you, Carson. I don't care what you discuss with the Go team, but you and I need to talk about that on air one day in the future, because honestly, I have so many thoughts on this. And I think there's a crisis identity around that, what is front end, what is back end, and as these things are interdependent, merging, talking to each other with a translation layer like JSON, or now kind of being able to make that simpler with just HTML. I mean, there's so much to discuss there. We can't get into it today, but I do want to touch upon web components and how HTMX plays with JavaScript specifically. So I haven't used HTMX in any production context, right? Just outside of looking at the docs. I'm very eager to try it, and so for me, my mental model of kind of looking at this is it feels like it kind of draws the outer boxes, it helps you manage that transclusion. But what's inside the HTML that's being transcluded, this swap, right? This element or whatever, or tree that's getting swapped in, that can be anything, right? The custom elements, web components, right? So I just want to talk about this, lit elements that are my favorite thing in the world. I love the lit API. It just makes it so easy to work with web components, and lit's having its it's having a huge surge in kind of adoption. Eager to have Justin Fagnani back on the show again. For those of you who missed it, highly recommend checking out that episode. We had him on the show a few months ago. And so how do web components and htmx, like how well do they play together? How well do they work together?
They play pretty well together. In htmx2, we have an engineer who's been working on making attributes within web components, htmx attributes within web components work. There's always that, the getting across the fence to the other side is always a trick. My theory on web components, they work, it's just HTML. That's one of the nice things about HTMX is it's leveraging the platform. And so as long as, we don't do anything too screwy, they just kind of work. But I think the integration story between web components and HTMX is, again, events. That to me is what the DOM is. It's this hierarchy, this tree of elements, and the way they should communicate. There's just looking back historically, the way that you've done loosely coupled user interfaces that sort of interact with one another without a hard interface between them, because there's no type safe interface on the DOM is via events. Now the events are tricky, and I'm old, so I programmed in something called HyperTalk, which was this thing called HyperCard back in the day. And so I've just always had a soft spot in my heart for events. Event-oriented programming does take a little bit to get used to, particularly if you're not just saying, I just want to handle clicks on this button. If you start saying things like, I want to listen for, an update event from this point in the DOM. And so there's a different mindset to adopt. But my theory here is that any sort of client-side enhancement, even if you were to say, we've got this little bit, we're going to do it in React because React has this feature that's super important to us for this part, but we want to integrate it with HTMX, I would say use an event. Have that thing when it's done doing its mutation, when it's built up the state locally that is ready to be synchronized to the server. At that point, have it emit an event to HTMX, and then HTMX can take over and do the state synchronization, which is what it's good at. So I think the same thing with web components. That's what I would look to in the web component world, and that's I say the same thing with JavaScript libraries. People ask me, how can I make my JavaScript library work better with HTMX? And I say, emit a bunch of events, because the more events you can emit in your lifecycle, the better an HTMX user can respond to those events in the ways that's appropriate for their use cases.
That makes so much sense.
This matches with my sort of belief about why we built web components, right? Was to return the idea of the component model to being something about creating things that platonically feel just like HTML elements. And that means that they coordinate with their tree peers and siblings and parents through events, and that they respond to attributes and JavaScript property changes like everything else. And so HTMX as a thing that just lives in and with and around HTML should, if your web components are built well, should just work, right? Like, this is the magic of things being composable on the DOM interface, and the idea of the platform being a platform for you rather than being an inconvenience that you target by side effect later.
Yeah. Here. And to just, I guess, another point to add here was, and you put this in the chat, Alex, so this is actually your point, which is not a React event, but a real event, right? Because React uses synthetic events. So the events, so if you're trying to pub or like wait for events and all of that, just use the real DOM events. And I have to say, the onload events on elements, like that's probably been the API that I've used most consistently throughout my entire career. The DOM is really rich in events. It'll tell you when things are done loading. It'll tell you all kinds of things. You just got to listen, So thank you for that amazing PSA, Carson. And so just going to end this conversation just talking a little bit about the delta that you see. I want to hear from you, Carson, on what is the platform missing? What's missing in browsers to kind of really elevate us to the next, that'll take us through the next era of the web, right? So what are we missing?
Yeah, well, I hope at this point people are starting to take an interest in HTMX. As far as just the concepts, one thing I say is that I think the ideas of HTMX are probably more important than the implementation, which is, written by a flawed person. But that idea of generalizing hypermedia controls, I'd like to see discussions around that at the platform level. And the tricky part there, and this is another long conversation, is getting accessibility right for a lot of this stuff is hard, and improving that so that things are more accessible by default. I think it's unrealistic. One thing I say is we should try and make accessibility accessible. And it's one of the glories of the web is that anyone can create a web page. And I think it's a shame to gatekeep that. I loved the early web when you could right click and view the source of a page and see what was going on. And so taking just this idea of generalizing hypermedia controls, another big thing, and this is pretty nerdy, but the ability to reparent an element in the DOM without losing the state associated with that element. So right now, if you take a video element and move it in the DOM, the video stops playing and kind of restarts. And similarly, if something has focus and you move it from one spot to another, it loses focus and so forth. And if you were able to move things around and not have them lose that sort of in-flight state, you could do a lot of very interesting transclusion work where elements could be preserved between navigations and even at the top level, like imagine a world where you could just have an anchor tag and you could mark a video as like, keep this thing around. And all someone has to write is an anchor tag and they can click and go to another, maybe a detail page for the video. The video keeps playing, but they've just authored HTML. They haven't had to do anything beyond that. That ability to do, I call it stable reparenting where elements don't lose state. That would be a huge feature in browsers. I think a lot of JavaScript platform, like people who are building on top of JavaScript would love that feature. I don't hear a lot about it, but I think if you showed it to them, it would be pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds amazing. I'm like, take me there. I want that future. That sounds really excellent. And I just really, Carson, like you're just so humble, and like I'm just so thankful for your contributions to like these important, not only discussions, but I would say like paradigm shifts, that like I think we're slowly but surely hopefully going to have. And it's just so great to hear that you're not antagonistic to JavaScript either, right? That you understand that it takes three to tango on the web, right? JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, you need all three to tango well, You can do a pretty bad tango with just like one or two of those, but to get the right mix, you need three. So I think for me as kind of someone that's really passionate about technical education, it's definitely a drum that like I hope to be able to kind of continue beating throughout my tenure here on this podcast, and hope to have more discussions with folks like you. Hope to have you back on the show, Carson. There's so many takes that I want to hear from you, including like your take on INP, which we kind of briefly so I think Alex mentioned it like an hour ago or something like that, but we didn't even get to click into that. It's Interaction to Next Paint, which is a new Core Web Vital that's landed that we're all really excited about. We'll probably do a show on that at some point soon. So just, again, many thank you, Carson, and many thanks to you, Alex. Alex, any kind of closing thoughts from you before we kind of wrap?
I would just say that we touched a little bit on how the browser kind of stopped delivering. We kind of got ourselves into a rut after the initial burst of energy around the initial, to borrow your phraseology, Carson, the hypermedia controls. And those built-in controls are extremely powerful, and they have not been configurable enough, and that has meant that people have lost faith in them and sort of moved to other places to get what they need done. So I would say if you care about those things improving, the OpenUI community group is still looking at those, and they can use your input. And we are starting to be able to deliver some of those things into the platform a little bit more credibly now, because browser competition is actually potentially going to become a real thing again. And I know this is a much longer conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing your...
Oh, yeah. I forgot that we wanted to talk about this and we completely missed it, Alex. Browser choice.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your conversation with the Open Web Advocacy folks, because they've been doing the most important work, I think, on the web in the last couple of years. I mean this in an absolute sense. Like, of any group, they are probably the most leveraged set of people who have created a larger, better potential future for us, because in a lot of ways, what we can ask of the platform is gated by the total channel capacity of the teams that implement browsers. And so if those teams are underfunded or they're stalled, then we can't ask for very much, and therefore we don't get very much. And so they have been doing the most to unblock that pipe and keep it open. So again, I can't wait to hear what they've got to say on your episode with them. But I would just say if folks aren't aware of what they're doing, they are looking for volunteers at open-web-advocacy.org. They've got a Discord. They've got a whole kind of rigmarole going, and you can be part of the solution too.
Yeah, and just thanks for ruining the surprise, Alex. Folks don't know that I was going to have them on the show. I guess they do know now. But yes, we're going to do a show with the folks that started the Open Web Advocacy Group. It's a group that's really been kind of fighting really hard, and literally like consulting with like nation states. Like they're like meeting with Korea and France and the EU, and like it's crazy. Like, but they are like talking to all these large, important entities about the importance of the web and the importance of like the free and open web with choice, browser choice. And that's just like one thing. I think like, I know there's other aspects that they're also advocating on, and that they're just like regular developers like us. And when I say regular, of course, like it's like regular in quotes, but I mean, like these aren't like policy PhDs or like these are like engineers that we know, including our very own Faraz, for our own Faraz is part of that group. So excited to have them come on the show and talk about that important topic. Obviously Safari's slowly gotten off the bench with kind of their support for PWAs, but it's far from like where it needs to be. And there's just bugs in the implementation and blah, 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 blah. It really interesting to see DHH kind of yell about this on the internet as well this past week, as he's like having trouble getting his app on the Apple's App Store approved. The Hey Calendar keeps getting rejected because according to him, it's because like he thinks it's because they're not willing to do kind of in-app purchases and give Apple that 30%. But but who knows? Either way, though, like no company should stop you from putting out a product onto the internet. And this is why like we need to fight for the open web. And so we'll put links into the show notes for you all to see funny tweets from DHH, including like a really funny. Did you all see the one where Alex? I know you're not on Twitter, but I sent you this link. Oh, and by the way, everyone, you remember last week I talked about a friend who judged me, one of the friends who judges me every time I send him a Twitter link. It's Alex Russell, judges me pretty hard. Yeah, he's put his hand up. Yeah. So every time I send links from Twitter.
Don't be on Twitter, y'all. Like, there's other places. You don't have to go to the Nazi bar. It's fine.
Oh, good Lord. Anyways, Nazi bar. Oh my gosh. Anyways, so there was this tweet where what did the DHH do? This one was hilarious. Yeah, he basically sent his mob of reply guys to Apple because Apple basically said like, what do you want the App Store to do or something? I don't even know. Or what are your favorite apps? I think of the year or productivity apps. And then like all his reply guys started like hounding Apple's marketing team around like, here's an app that I wish was on the store. So anyways, pretty hilarious. Sorry for the tangent. But so to wrap up our show, this was epic, long discussion. It's going to require, I think, a couple of listens for me as I like unpack all the information that was shared. Carson, any kind of closing thoughts from you before we wrap?
Yeah, again, I just want to stress that de-escalation. Like hypermedia is a tool, and I think it's an interesting tool, even if your listeners don't end up using it. We did release a book. It's available for free online at hypermedia.systems, and that particularly for developers who just have never really worked with like a Web 1.0 style application, that'll kind of walk them through the history of hypermedia, and then it builds a simple Web 1.0 style web application, and then enhances that with htmx. So that might be a good sort of more long form introduction to htmx. There's a lot of stuff on the essays page, htmx.org/essays. Some of those are pretty serious, some of them are less serious, and definitely the least serious of the bunch is I'm sorry, Alex, but my Twitter account, which is twitter.com/htmx_org. Every time I think about going to a Mastodon server, there's always a no posting stipulation, and I'm like, oh man, I don't know how to do it without.
That's so funny. All right. Well, and are you available for hire for other like library authors or maintainers that need some marketing help, Carson? I'm just curious.
You don't. No, I'm literally the dog flying the airplane that has no idea what it's doing. I'm just like, I don't know, man. At some point, this all ends in tears.
Oh my gosh, you're too humble. Well, again, many, many, many thanks to both of you. So Carson, where can folks find you on the internet? Same question for you, Alex. If they want to connect, what's the best way for them to connect with y'all?
BigSky.software is my software company. It's just me. I don't know. Go to Montana State. I teach you some computer science if you go to Montana State.
Are you guys available like online? Is there like an online course that people could like join where you are their professor?
No, we don't have anything online.
Okay. So they have to literally fly to Montana.
Yeah. Unfortunately, at this point, you have to go to Montana State. I don't know.
Okay, that's not bad. Montana's a beautiful state. I would love to go.
Yeah, Montana is it's very cold, but it is very pretty.
For sure. How about you, Alex?
You can find many links at infrequently.org and a lot of very long blog posts that cover some of the background about my agitation and links to other ways to get a hold of me.
Yeah, one of the best blogs on the internet, by the way. So everyone should like RSS feed that, like hands down, like incredible writing. And thank you for all the advocacy and the work that you do as well, Alex. Like, super appreciate you. And so with that said, we are gonna wrap, kids. It's been a long one. Many thanks. I hope you learned a few things and hope you all get to play around with HTMX and also Lit. Play around with Lit too. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
Is our show for this week. Thanks for partying with us. Next up on the pod, Front End Feud. Yes, our award-worthy game show is back, and the CSS podcast is back to defend their title against our challengers from compressed.fm. Subscribe to the pod so you don't miss it. Head to jsparty.fm for all the ways, or just search for JS Party in your podcast app of choice. You'll find us. Thanks again to our partners at fly.io, to our Beat Freak in residence, Breakmaster Cylinder, and to you for listening. We appreciate you spending time with us. That is all for now, but come back and party with us again next week.